very significant. So we will continue with that discussion, and perhaps I would ask you about what happened after that. What were I guess what were what were the beginnings of that articulation of what you have seen, and then and so how did you proceed in developing your thoughts on what would later become the Jewish Theology of Liberation?
Well, I'd already started with the Holocaust through Richard Rubinstein, who wrote After Auschwitz. He published it in 1966. And I was studying with him at Florida State University in the early 1970s when what I call Holocaust theology began. It was around Rubinstein's work, but also more famously Elie Wiesel and Emil Fackenheim and Rabbi Irving Greenberg. And I was familiar with all of them, but needed to go deeper into their thought. And their thought was, very simply, that Jews had suffered and that God was absent in that suffering, and we needed to empower ourselves, and that Israel was a concrete example of that empowerment. That was so necessary for Jews that if you went against it, if you disputed it, if you didn't want it, if you wanted it overthrown, and that was usually thought of as Palestinians, but if you became an agent for that, you were going against Jewish history and the Jewish people. The Holocaust was the nadir of our existence, and Israel was part of our redemption. It didn't bring God back, but since God was absent in the Holocaust, all of the Holocaust theologians thought that, we now had to take it on ourselves, the Jewish people. And the Jewish people had decided, in their view, that empowerment in Israel was the only possible answer to the Holocaust. So I was quite steeped in that. When I encountered Palestinians face to face and traveled with them, traveled Jewishly with them, it was such a contradiction to that redemptive aspect of Israel. What do you do with that when your theology is hit like a storm, like a typhoon, tornado, a hurricane, and all of a sudden Holocaust theology begins to be blown apart? And what Holocaust theologians did when they heard dissent, they would clamp down on it and say this was anti-Semitic or a self-hating Jew. So in that environment, this cognitive dissonance that I experienced it not theoretically or intellectually, I experienced it forcefully, personally, experientially. I had to decide what to do. Toss it aside, not believe it, neglect it, think it's not important, or take it to heart. Once I took it to heart, which I believe I had no choice but to do, I had to find my voice. And since the power of Holocaust theology was so great, the evidence of what I was seeing was not available to me. It wasn't clear if I had experienced it only. Well, that couldn't be true, but who else had experienced it? And how could I get in touch with that experience? And how could I unfold my experience and other people's experiences when I found those experiences into a narrative that could be my own and I could feel authentic and correct in presenting, when probably there would be a storm against it. Now, last time I said to you, I didn't really realize anything about the storm that was to come. I wasn't thinking about that, but I had a storm inside me. I had to satisfy myself. But I didn't also go through, a categorization or a checklist, or if I had done that, I also couldn't have spoken. So I was just forced, in my view, almost without a choice. I mean, I know I had a choice, but I didn't feel that I did, to begin to find the information. And where could I find it? I just found it here and there. I picked up stray articles by Irving Greenberg that weren't published in books, but they were in little pamphlets. I don't even remember where I found them. I read more Holocaust theology, including Irving Greenberg's essay in 1974, this big Holocaust conference. And again, now I was reading Holocaust theology with this experience of traveling Jewish among Palestinians. So it wasn't just Holocaust anymore, but what we were doing, and were they addressing it? And if they were addressing it, how? And for them, Palestinians were either absent or terrorists, people who were anti-Semitic, who wanted to deprive us of what we needed, but I was experiencing something else. So I found things. I came across a book about Israel's global reach and Israel's supplying of arms to Central America. And then I had footnotes there that I followed. And these were all dissident publications that were not well known. And I started searching and started coming across them. We didn't have the internet then or anything like that. You couldn't Google it. I had to piece it together because I was piecing my voice together. And then I took it on the road very quickly. Some would say too quickly. And as I was being hit by force against it, often by progressive Jews, not conservative Jews who weren't usually in the audience, but progressive Jews who wanted to preserve in front of others and for themselves that we were innocent. And so back then, it's hard to imagine, but back when I wrote Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, on college campuses to speak about Palestinians and use the word Palestinian was extremely controversial. It was seen as an assault on Jewish innocence. So I began to understand belatedly, but quickly, that the language I was beginning to use was really controversial. And was being hit at. I would be yelled at in the talks that I gave. I would be threatened, often with death and physical violence. On campuses, I would be escorted by campus police. In hotels, I often had to check in under an assumed name. It was what we think is quite mild today. And even to say two states at that time, a Palestinian state. And I went further, that we as Jews had to confess to Palestinians we had done something wrong. All of that was considered an assault on Jews, even when delivered by a Jew. So the question they had was, what's wrong with me? Who are you? And what right do you have to speak? And are you really Jewish? And do you look Jewish? Oh, you don't really look Jewish. All sorts of unbelievable things were hurled at anyone, I experienced it personally, who spoke favorably about Palestinians, that they weren't absent or terrorists, but they were actually decent people, and they were struggling for their freedom, and their freedom was being thwarted by Israel, that is, Jews in Israel, with the support of the Jewish establishment in the United States, including the progressive Jews all through university campuses. And of course, columnists and all Jewish progressives, very good on every issue except that one.
Yeah, and then we were talking about the universalist justice seeking. So going back to what you said about language. So you are using, in articulating that, you are using a language that was not available, or it wasn't the language that is being used even by progressive Jews. Where did that language come from? because when people listen to you, they would say that's not Jewish. So what is that language, or where did that language come from? How would you describe it?
It came from the search for justice for a people that we were oppressing. But the details of it, so for instance, that Israel was heavily involved in arming oppressive governments in Central America that were killing their own people, killing Catholic missionaries, killing the possibility of justice, that was a language in and of itself. It wasn't specific words so much.
Mm-hmm.
It was the idea that Jews were not innocent, that we had been innocent in many ways, as oppressed people are, not because they're perfect, but because they're on the other side of power. Once we got power, you see, Jews thought, and progressive Jews thought, and it's an amazing thought, but it's very Jewish in a contemporary way, that we were innocent in our suffering and innocent in our empowerment. But what I realized was we weren't innocent in our empowerment. And that was the kind of language and the need to confess to the Palestinian people. You know, the way Jews talked about Palestinians was they were uncivilized. They were dirty. I mean, very racist understandings of Arabs and Palestinians. So when you said something positive about them, how could that be? And if you argued that they could actually bond with Jews in a new configuration, how could they do that? They were uncivilized. So just to suggest that we weren't innocent and that Palestinians weren't uncivilized, I mean, that itself was very explosive at the time. And maybe in some ways still today, although we don't use the rhetoric, that rhetoric, and that Israel wasn't our redemption. So my title, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, although it was published by Harper, big commercial firm, tanked, hardly sold at all because of that language, Beyond Innocence and Redemption. It's all English, you know, it's not, I didn't get it from Mars. Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli power, say Israeli power, confronting the Holocaust, not the Holocaust didn't happen, but how we use the Holocaust. And then the third subtitle is Creating a Moral Future for the Jewish People. And people would say, we have a moral present. And I was saying, no, we don't, no longer. So putting my experience together with the cognitive dissonance that I was experiencing and just fusing it into a narrative itself was subversive.
Yeah.
And that I was arguing from a Jewish tradition, that I was arguing that we as Jews were squandering our inheritance, our ethical inheritance, and even this suffering in the Holocaust. We were squandering it by oppressing another people. You might think, some might think today, well, it's so obvious, you know, come on, let's get with it, let's think about it. But believe me, it wasn't then, and in some quarters still isn't acceptable, and worse. And Irving Greenberg used to say that the one excommunicable sin in the present, in the Jewish present, was undermining the empowerment in Israel. And intentionally, as he said, or unintentionally, creating the groundwork or the context for another Holocaust. So now, this is another part of the seriousness. When you emerge, when 2/3 of European Jews were systematically murdered just years before I was born, and we had finally come from underneath European history and become empowered, which I support our empowerment. And finally, we had a way to create our own destiny. But in a very short time, then all of a sudden you have someone and a few others saying, wait a minute, what in God's name are we doing? You know, the establishment, any establishment wants to say, don't say that, don't quit, don't air your dirty laundry in public. And what I said was, if we were in the Warsaw Ghetto, I wouldn't. But now we are empowered. So the idea of Jewish empowerment itself, that now needs to be questioned, critically examined, that was also extremely explosive.
Yeah. So,
because
yeah.
Good and innocent, that was how we defined, we're good. And now you're saying we're not? We're innocent. And now you're saying we're culpable? We need power, and now you say we need to confess? And to them, those people, those uncivilized Arabs who want to destroy us, that was the mindset.
Yeah. So, yeah. So even the titles of your books, you know, that's Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Toward the Jewish Theology of Liberation, and even in the following, in the books that you have written after that, you know, the titles and the language is very much different. Although, as you said, you are arguing from a Jewish tradition. And many of those titles, as you have said in some of your writings, that they come from images.
Yes.
And can you talk about those images? I mean, those are very controversial images, like, you know, the Star of David, helicopter gunships, and all of these images. And you said they come from somewhere else. But
Yeah.
these images were actually the ones that very central to the books and to your writings and even to the titles. Can you talk about those images? You are very much shaped by these images. Okay, I know these images come from somewhere else, but can you talk more about this?
All I can tell you is that all of my books come from experiences and images, and often from poems. There are a number of books that I wrote a poem before I started the book, and the book came out of the poem, even if the poem didn't appear in the book. So, well, yes, what I can say is that these images come to me. I don't know why they come to me, but Beyond Innocence and Redemption. And I used to say, well, it should have been like, Let Us Love Israel, a title or something like that, or, you know, and it might have sold well, and I might have become very well known. It was a lousy title to sell, because at that time, it's very interesting, we had independent bookstores that sold most of these books. This was way before the internet. And most of these bookstores, these really good ones, on the West Coast and the East Coast, a lot of them were owned by progressive Jews. And a lot of the guardians, the ones who brought the books in or didn't, were progressive Jews. Good, on every issue, like feminism and all of that, terrific. But when they saw these titles, they thought, no. Either they didn't want to see it, or they didn't think their clientele would want to see it. So you have this thing of me, people brag about being published by university presses. You know, that's a big deal in the academy. But I was published by presses that actually sold books. And the ones that I was published that sold books didn't sell any books. I'll give you another story about Beyond Innocence and Redemption. They didn't sell any of my books. Edward Said, years after I wrote Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, and probably right after Beyond Innocence and Redemption was published, Edward Said wrote me a letter. This is a whole story about him writing me a letter and me getting again, this is when letters were written and you got the envelope, and I looked at it. It was addressed to me and it was to my home. And on the top, it said, from Columbia University, this and that. And I looked at, and it was handwritten above that, and it said, Edward Said. And I thought to myself, Edward Said at Columbia University has just written me a letter. Well, he had read some of my writing. And he was, and I developed a relationship with him, which was very momentous in my life. But he was asked by the Washington Post to review a book titled Tough Jews. And it was a little bit about Israel, but it was not like mine, but it was a good book at that time. And he asked them if he could also review with that My Beyond Innocence and Redemption. And that would have put the Washington Post, Book Review, and Edward Said, and they said no. And I believe they said no because of the title. They weren't going to put their name to that title because they believed, either they believed it was anti-Semitic or they would be accused of being anti-Semitic. So there you have the fact that they would ask a famous Palestinian to write a review. That's already progress. But when he wants to, and they asked him to review a book about Jews, which was critical of Jews, but mine was too much, just the title itself. So these images, like Star of David helicopter gunships in the Ark of the Covenant, and Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, have been costly images for me. And yet they are what came to me, and they're part of my truth telling. And I don't know where they came from, and they keep coming to me, like dystopic solidarity. These images, some of which I don't understand at first, and some of which need to be explained to me or kind of walk through with me so I understand them more. They just come to me, usually from an experience that I have, and it just comes to me. And I'm not going to be too helpful on how they come to me, and somewhere else doesn't help, but that's where I feel it comes from.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about you were arguing from a Jewish tradition, and yeah, because I'm thinking about, you know, most progressive Jews who would be arguing from the point of view of justice would always refer to the scripture, you know, to the ethical tradition of Jewishness. What tradition are you referring to?
Well, they would argue from the biblical and from philosophical things, but they left out a major issue. The key issue, Palestinians. I started with the Holocaust and Palestine. So I didn't start, you know, when you start from the Bible, or you start from Jewish philosophers that everyone loves, like Emanuel Levinas, and we could go through a whole number of them, many great people, but the issue facing us was Palestinians, and the confrontation came through the Holocaust, because Israel would never have happened, in my view, without the Holocaust. And all of us were arguing that the reason for Israel was the Holocaust, and Holocaust theologians who were very powerful in the Jewish community, extremely powerful, were arguing that the Holocaust superseded everything, and Israel superseded everything other than the Holocaust. So to start with the Bible and say the Bible says that we should be for justice and all was basically a deflection. And most of Jewish studies wasn't dealing with the Bible at the time. They were dealing with things that were good about Jews, because they were in universities trying to teach the good face of Jews and Judaism, which is understandable after the history of denigrating Jews and Judaism that we had experienced. And then all of a sudden we're saying very quickly, remember, that, wait a minute, you can't just say that about Jews. I believe that Jews are good and Judaism is good and all of that, but wait a minute, what are we doing?
Because I remember some some who would give you this would describe you as and these are people who support you, who are very much taken by your word, and they would say, his Marc Ellis is so courageous that he would go against his own tradition. But you said you are actually arguing from your tradition, and so why do you think that was?
I don't know. They have all sorts of views of the way they describe me. Even people who like what I'm doing, sometimes very foreign to me. You feel like there must be a Marc Ellis. There's another Marc Ellis out there who writes books with the same title. Even people who support me, I often think, well, wait a minute, that's not how I would describe myself. So when you're a public figure and a controversial one, you're going to be described even by your friends in ways that sometimes you just think, well, there must be another person with that name who writes books with these titles. I've never been against Jewish. In fact, I'd have to be an idiot to do what I've done unless I loved being Jewish. And then people criticize me for loving being Jewish too much too. It's impossible, because I believe some very traditional things about Jews and Judaism and about the exceptionality of Jews and the prophetic as the indigenous and the root of the prophetic around the world. And people say, that's too much. You're prizing Jews among others. And then others say, you're downing Jews, you want Israel destroyed. I don't want Israel destroyed, I want it transformed. And I understand, and that's the other thing, even now today with this issue of colonialism and all of that, nobody can even argue that there was a reason for Israel from certain perspectives within Jewish history. So I'm much more nuanced than a lot of folks. I understand why there's a state of Israel after the Holocaust, but I don't accept the oppression of another people. So some of the criticism of Israel, to my mind, it's not that it's wrong, it's too glib. And there are people, of course, who use Israel as a battering ram against Jews. I know, I've been around people. I've had many experiences of this. I'm with you. I love Palestinians. I hate Israel. No, that's not me. You're not with me. And I've had people who lift me up on a pedestal and I say, take me down. And by the way, stay away from me. So there, and that's in BDS movement too. And when I talk about this, the first time I traveled in Europe with the BDS movement, or I was a guest in Scotland and in Ireland, the two leaders there were deeply anti-Semitic. They didn't have a different view of Israel than I did or something, an argument. They were anti-Semites. Now, most BDS is not that at all. But if you're asking me whether I identify with everybody who criticizes Israel, the answer is no, because some of it is anti-Jewish, is ambivalent about Jews, is ambivalent about, the Jewish conspiracy theories, and those who say, the senator from Tel Aviv in terms of US senators, this stuff disgusts me. So I've never been in any camp. I've never been comfortable with any group. And the way people describe me, people that hate me and people who love me, most of the times I ask myself, who are they talking about? And then you become a symbol. And you begin to think of yourself as a symbol. And then you think, well, wait a minute, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me, that's part of me, but that's not the whole thing, and you're going too far and you're twisting it there. It's a very complex situation because I do argue from the Jewish tradition, and a love of being Jewish, and I am against what we're doing to Palestinians.
And then maybe those things that you put together really, it is also causing cognitive dissonance from others.
Yeah.
So I think most people, even if there are those who are, who love you, and those who, who would be totally against what you're saying. I think the difficulty is trying to, pin you down, or to put you in a category. And you seem to be very resistant into those categories. Have you ever thought about that? Why is it that you cannot be categorized? What is it? And you are seen as a one-off. What have you thought about that? Why is it?
Well, I think it goes back to the prophetic tradition. I mean, you look at the biblical prophets, you can't really quote a lot of what they say. You can quote some of what they say, but you can quote other things that are so negative toward Israel, they would be considered anti-Semitic today. By the way, the only resistance wasn't among Jews, but around progressive Christians who were confessing their sins of anti-Semitism against Jewish history and the Jewish people. These people were very resistant too. I think the problem with the study of the prophets in contemporary life, especially in the seminaries, especially in Christian seminaries, is they've Christianized the prophets. Walter Brueggemann's an example. He basically makes the prophets Christians. Yes, everything's bad, everything's critical, but there's going to be redemption. So the prophet and the prophetic coming home is not going to be appreciated by any group in and of itself. Parts can be appreciated, parts can be opposed, but there's too much cognitive dissonance. For instance, Noam Chomsky was very controversial, but got away from, he never speaks as a Jew. He speaks as an American patriot in a way, and critical of American policy. He's much easier to read and to take than I am. Now you think, well, he's an icon, of course. I'm not arguing about that. But that's much easier. His critique of Israel, to me, is much easier. And you get Norman Finkelstein and stuff. And these secular critiques are informative, but then they're not as nearly as deep and troubling as a voice that comes from deep within the Jewish tradition. That's my perspective. And that I've had to think about why I not only can't be accepted by many, but won't allow myself to be accepted by many. I've had to think about that. Is it a personality disorder? You have to think about these things when you're, lying in bed at night and wondering why, So I didn't seek it out, but it may be that I couldn't have allowed well, here's the deal too. Progressive Jews, when I came on the scene, of course, they were the dominant ones and they wanted, and they sought to bring me in, some of them, under their tutelage. But I didn't want to be tutored by them because I found out that a lot of them were shading the truth that they knew. Now, you ask yourself, if I were to be accepted by them, I wouldn't have had to shade the truth that I saw 80% or 70% or 60%. I had to shade the truth 10%. But that 10% was everything. Now you ask the question, or you're thinking of the question, or I think you're thinking of the question, why don't you just do the 10%? Who cares?
That's right. I mean, why don't you, why do you have to be so uncompromising?
Well, it's not, well, I don't know why I couldn't do it. I couldn't, I would have been lying. Now, I'm not above anything that anyone else does. This is not my point. It's like these images. I should have contained them. I should have written them down in a notebook and buried them. I should never have spoken them or written them or continually brought them up. But I couldn't help myself because I just couldn't see that what was happening to us as Jews and be silent or cut it back. Now, again, one could criticize me. I'd have a lot more money, a lot more positions, a lot more invitations. I'd even have honors. I might have even got an honorary PhD, and oh my God, the world, I may have been at Harvard teaching. And I'm not against any of that, but who would I have been? In my view, I'm just talking for myself. I didn't want to be like those who saw what I saw. What, did I see something they didn't see? Well, yeah, I went among Palestinians. That was very early, and they didn't. They hadn't. Okay, so I did see things. But in general, I wasn't above them. I wasn't brighter than them or more ethical than them or anything. I don't believe that at all. I used to say, so people used to say, well, how did you, in a very genuine way, how, after hearing me speak, how did you come to this? It's so unusual. So I was asked that many times. I had to think about it because everybody wants an answer, like you said with the images. Where did they come from? You want an answer. And I finally said to myself, how did they not come to this narrative or this speech? Not how did I? Since I believe that I'm an ordinary Jew with the same indigenous prophetic they have. It's not how I came to it. How did they not come to it? Well, maybe they did and they were afraid. Maybe they were just afraid. And for good reason. But, you know, I was at Contour once, because I went there many times afterwards, and two of the great Jewish theologians of our time said to me, Mark, come and pray with us. And I thought, no, I don't want to pray with you. You're lying. Well, that was the end of my acceptance by them. But if I had accepted their desire to tame me and discipline me, see, this is what they wanted. They wanted the speech. They didn't want me to give up my ethical bearing or the fact that Palestinians were, deserved human rights. They didn't want me to give that up. They wanted me to shut up these images. They wanted to discipline. The prophets are always disciplined by the community, the prophetic. And these were progressive Jews who were considered prophetic who wanted to discipline me. I didn't want to be disciplined. I'm not going to be disciplined. I may suffer. I may lose all of that. I may have anxiety, but you're not ultimately going to shut me up, or as I used to say, the only way you could shut me up is to put a bullet in my head, which I don't want. But you're never going to keep me silent about this. Never. So don't try. Now, does that lead anywhere? That's a different story. That's another story.
Yeah, that's what later on. What I would like to ask. At what cost, and is that cost worth it? And that will be maybe the next part of the discussion. But before we wrap this up, I just want to ask a question, because the high holidays are coming up, and you were talking about the confession, which is very central to how you think about the prophetic and how you developed your thinking about Israel-Palestine. So we always hear you saying about confession, and many times when you are asked to speak, you always begin with a confession. Tell us more about why do you start with that confession always?
Well, I started in 1987 in Jerusalem when I launched my book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. When I said that we needed to confess to the Palestinian people that as Jews, what we had done to Palestinians was wrong. And as Jews, what we are doing to the Palestinians is wrong. And here, as we enter the high holidays, which is supposed to be a time of renewal and confession, especially Yom Kippur, we have never confessed to the Palestinian people. So what is a confession? That I didn't give a pack of gum to somebody that I promised it? Or, you know, this thing about Lent, one of the editors of a Jewish newspaper said that she was going to confess that there were typos in her emails because she wasn't focusing. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Here we are ghettoizing, ethnically cleansing and ghettoizing and murdering. And during the high holidays, there's a closure in Israel where Palestinians are closed down. Like we were closed down. So the confession has to be real. What we are doing, not what we're thinking about doing, or I'm sorry I yelled at you and I promised you an ice cream and I didn't deliver. You know, what's the high holidays? I mean, you know, it becomes like Christmas or Easter, where Christians have all of these rituals, but what they have done in history. And so, you know, part of this journey was, as I said last time, my feelings about Christians, Christian history, very ambivalent, but I was meeting Christians who were different. And I wanted to keep meeting them, really as a way of healing this history. And watching them do their rituals and proclaiming Christ, and even now they want to bring Christ back into this and that. I don't want any of that. What is that going to do? You know, so then we embark on this wholesale destruction of a culture and a people. And we want to go to a synagogue and say, yeah, I'm so sorry I yelled at you. Remember when I yelled at you a few weeks ago? That was wrong. Please forgive me. No. What we're doing, and we're organized as a community and now as a state, to destroy, to ethnically cleanse and ghettoize an entire people. Without that confession. But I would say that about Christians, and we could say that about Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists. We could go on, but I'm Jewish.
Yeah, but when you say confession, and that means, you know, recognizing what is being done to the Palestinian people. And I think about all these Jewish, you know, historians and political analysts, where they expose, and when they say, isn't that also a confession, or how do you see these things?
Yes, for instance, Ilan Pape, his of course, these are confessions, and I've used his work, and he was, I've met him a number of times and had a discussion with him lately, actually in Turkey, because he had recommended to a student many years ago my tour to Jewish Theology of Liberation. And this is an interesting story because it tells something about it. I said to him, I said, Ilan, I had this student who told me that you had recommended the book, which means you probably had read. Oh, yes, I read it, and right after it was published. I said, well, you are a great Israeli Jewish new historian, one of the most important historians, Jewish historians of our time. And he never really doesn't talk about being Jewish, especially in his historical record. And I said, well, what did you get out of Tour to Jewish Theology of Liberation? He said, well, I was beginning to embark on this new history, which he had learned in Middle Eastern studies, but obviously had been influenced by the prophetic to look at it this way, hadn't he? But he said reading Tour to Jewish Theology of Liberation gave him Jewish permission as a Jew to speak as a Jew. Well, it was very important to me. And and I've had other Jewish writers who are very critical of Israel who never talk about their Jewishness, who come up to me when they meet me and say, I read your book. That was so important to me, although they never mentioned the book or me, or the fact of their Jewishness. And the difference between Chomsky, who's an icon, and Ilan Pappé, who's another icon, all of these famous Jewish thinkers, is that I named, sometimes for Chomsky, maybe, because he made a comment about that once about me, but also Said, Edward Said, and others, and Ilan Pappé, that I named the prophetic, which they were expecting from their Jewishness or from Jews, but we're not seeing and we're not naming. And I think the importance of my work, if I look at it, again, I didn't strategize, it's just the way I write and think. And even the 68th birthday that I've just had, where we had videos brought in, they all seem to emphasize this, which is very interesting, that of the videos that were wishing me a happy birthday, they were all in the prophetic line. They all do prophetic things, but it seemed to be that the naming of it from the tradition as it evolves in our time was important to them. And I think now, after hearing this and hearing others, this was the most disturbing thing about my writing and my speaking. And remember, I traveled Jewish then all over the world after Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation was published, all over in another way in 40 or 45 countries. The importance of naming the prophetic again, even though everyone kind of assumed, well, I'm in the prophetic line, but what does that mean? And that's the explosive thing, and I believe that's the only thing that will bring Israel to some kind of reckoning, not the politics, although we need that, but this confessional clarity. What we as Jews have done to you, the Palestinian people, is wrong. What we as Jews are doing to you, the Palestinian people, is wrong. That's the key. It's not just an analysis of colonialism and ethnic cleansing. This is all important, very important, and I've learned a lot through the years. But the key to it all is the prophetic announcement that Israel is squandering, Israel the state, but Israel the people, is squandering our ethical history in oppressing another people.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's we could end with that. We could end this discussion with that, and then we will continue. Again, I'd like to explore more about the this confession, especially as as this high holidays is coming, and what does it mean for, as you said, what does it mean at the end of the ethical Jewish history? So that's it, and thank you again, Professor Ellis.
Well, thank you so much.